Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. Let me start with some background. I'm OP and I run a successful online business from home. Nothing flashy, just good old-fashioned web development and e-commerce consulting that's been treating me well for the past decade. A few years back, I was finally able to buy my dream property. A modest but modern house sitting on 15 acres of beautiful wooded land. The property has everything I wanted, including a private pond, dense forest, and most importantly, complete privacy from the world. The house itself isn't anything fancy. It's clean and well-maintained, but definitely not what you'd call a mansion. What makes it special is the land around it. Those 15 acres are my sanctuary. I work from home most days, and when I need a break from screens and code, I head out to my large, detached garage where I work on my passion project. That passion project is a 1968 Ford Mustang that I've been restoring for the past 2 years. It's a labor of love that's been taking up most of my free time. Right now, the car is completely disassembled. Primer-covered panels stacked against walls, engine parts carefully organized on stands, transmission components laid out on workbenches. To me, it's organized chaos with a clear vision. To someone else walking by, I guess it might look like a junkyard. Everything was peaceful until about 8 months ago when developers started construction on what they called a luxury housing development right at the edge of my property. They clear-cut every tree right up to my property line and built about 20 cookie-cutter houses that they're selling for ridiculous prices. The marketing materials called it an exclusive community for discerning homeowners who appreciate fine living. Once people started moving in, I began noticing small issues. I'd find dogs running loose on my property, families having picnics by my private pond, and kids playing in my woods like it was some kind of community park. I put up several clearly marked private property signs, but they seemed to disappear or get ignored regularly. Most of the time I just chalked it up to new residents not understanding the property boundaries. The real trouble started about 3 months ago when the woman I'll call my neighbor moved into the house that sits closest to my property line. From day one, she established herself as the unofficial neighborhood watch captain. I'd see her walking around with a notebook, taking pictures of things, and generally acting like she owned the entire development. Our first encounter happened on a Saturday morning while I was working in my garage with the doors open. I was wearing my usual work clothes, old jeans and a stained t-shirt, and had grease on my hands from working on the Mustang's transmission. I heard footsteps on my gravel driveway and looked up to see this woman marching straight toward my workshop. She didn't introduce herself or even say hello. Instead, she stopped about 10 feet away, put her hands on her hips, and let out this dramatic sigh. Then she said something about being afraid this would happen and that I couldn't run a chop shop in a respectable community. I was honestly confused at first. I wiped my hands on a rag and calmly explained that this was my workshop on my property, and I was restoring a classic car, not running any kind of business. She looked me up and down, taking in my work clothes and the disassembled car parts, and scoffed. She informed me that they had a very strict homeowners association and that she'd be reporting this mess. I had 72 hours to clear out all the junk. When I told her my property wasn't part of any homeowners association, she just ignored me completely and walked away muttering about property values and community standards. I figured that would be the end of it. I mean, what could she actually do? My property predated her development by several years, and I wasn't part of their HOA, but I was wrong about that being the end of it. 3 days later, I found something zip-tied to my workshop door that made my blood pressure spike. It was a laminated notice printed on official-looking letterhead for something called the Neighborhood Aesthetics Committee. The document was a final warning citing various made-up violations, including inoperable vehicles on residential property, unlicensed home business operations, and failure to maintain community appearance standards. The notice threatened a $500 fine and stated that the vehicle would be towed at the owner's expense if not removed within 24 hours. The whole thing was written in this aggressive, official-sounding language with numbered subsections and references to bylaws that didn't exist. I took a photo of the notice for my records and threw it in the trash. The whole thing was legally meaningless since my property had nothing to do with their development, but it showed me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Someone who thought they could invent authority and use intimidation to get their way. The deadline came and went. I continued working on my Mustang because, frankly, some neighbors' delusions weren't going to interfere with my hobby. But my neighbor wasn't done escalating things. 2 days after her fake deadline passed, I was inside the house when I heard shouting from my driveway. I looked out the window and saw her standing at the edge of my property with what I assumed was her husband trailing behind, looking uncomfortable. She was yelling about warnings and property values and how she wasn't going to let me drag down their community with my filth. She was waving her arms around and getting increasingly worked up as she spoke. Her husband kept trying to get her to calm down, but she wasn't having it. I went outside and tried to reason with her. I explained again that this was my property and that she was trespassing and harassing me. I told her if she didn't leave, I'd be the one calling the police. That was apparently the wrong thing to say because she completely lost it. She started screaming about how I was threatening her on community property and that I was probably just some squatter who had no right to be there. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right there in front of me. I could hear her side of the conversation clearly, and it was nothing like what was actually happening. She told the dispatcher there was a strange, aggressive man squatting in a workshop in their neighborhood. She said he was running some kind of illegal auto shop and had just threatened her and her husband. She made it sound like they were in immediate danger and needed officers sent immediately. I just stood there listening to this performance, honestly impressed by how convincing she sounded. If I didn't know better, I'd probably believe her story too. Within about 10 minutes, 2 police cars showed up with lights flashing. The officers got out looking like they were responding to a serious situation. My neighbor immediately ran over to them, putting on this show like she was a terrified victim who had just escaped danger. The lead officer approached me with his hand resting on his radio. He was professional, but clearly on high alert. He explained they'd received a report about a squatter and some threats and asked me to tell them what was happening. Before I could answer, my neighbor jumped in, insisting I was the problem. She told the officers I'd been living in the filthy garage and refusing to leave despite multiple warnings from the homeowners association. The officer asked to see my identification. I nodded and told him it was inside my house. As I started to head toward the front door, I had an idea that would save everyone a lot of time. I pulled out my phone and opened up the county's GIS mapping system. It's a public website that shows property boundaries and ownership information for the entire county. I pulled up my property and showed the screen to the officers. The map clearly displayed my 15-acre parcel with the property lines highlighted in bright yellow. My name was right there listed as the owner. But here's where it got really interesting. I zoomed in on the section where my property met the new development. The property line ran right along the edge of the houses, just like I thought. But when I looked closer at my neighbor's house, I noticed something that made me smile. Her brand new fence that her husband had spent the previous weekend installing was a good 5 feet inside my property line. Not only that, but her elaborate flower garden with the expensive landscaping was also on my land. The officers looked at the map, then looked at each other, then looked at my neighbor who had gone completely silent. The change in their demeanor was immediate and obvious. The lead officer thanked me politely for clarifying the situation, then turned to my neighbor with a much more serious tone. He explained that she had filed a false police report, which was a serious offense. Not only that, but she was currently standing on my private property without permission, which constituted trespassing. My neighbor's face went through several different colors as the reality of the situation hit her. Her husband looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The officer asked me if I wanted to press charges for the false report and trespassing. I looked at my neighbor, who was now completely deflated, then at her expensive new fence sitting on my property. I told the officers I didn't want to ruin anyone's life, but I did want this harassment to stop. I offered a deal. I wouldn't press charges if she agreed to 2 conditions. First, she would pay for a licensed surveyor to come out and officially stake the property line so there would be no future confusion. Second, she would pay for a crew to move her entire fence to the correct location on her side of the line. She had 1 week to get both things done. Faced with the possibility of criminal charges, she tearfully agreed to my terms. The officers made sure she understood the seriousness of filing false reports and warned her about any future harassment. After everyone left, I went back to working on my Mustang with a much better mood than I'd had in weeks. True to the agreement, a surveyor showed up 3 days later and placed official markers along my entire property line. The survey confirmed what the GIS map had shown. Her fence and garden were definitely on my land. 2 days after that, a landscaping crew arrived to move her fence. I happened to be working on my deck that afternoon, so I had a front row seat to watch the whole operation. My neighbor stood in her yard supervising the work with this furious expression while her husband tried to make small talk with the workers. When the crew foreman came over to apologize for any noise, I told him to take their time and do it right. I even offered them cold water bottles from my cooler. The best part was when my neighbor realized that moving the fence 5 feet closer to her house significantly reduced the size of her backyard. The flower garden had to be completely redesigned since half of it was now on my side of the line. Word spread quickly through the development about what had happened. Within a week, the trespassing issues completely stopped. No more dogs on my property, no more families at my pond, no more kids in my woods. Apparently, the story of the guy who actually owned all that land behind their houses was quite the conversation starter. My neighbor and her husband never made eye contact with me again. If they saw me outside, they'd quickly go back inside their house. The transformation from entitled neighborhood enforcer to embarrassed homeowner was remarkable. I finished the Mustang restoration about a month later. It turned out even better than I'd hoped. A real beauty that runs like a dream. I take it out for drives on weekend mornings, and I always make sure to rev the engine a little when I pass by my neighbor's house. The whole experience taught me something important about assumptions and entitlement. My neighbor saw a guy in work clothes with a disassembled car and immediately decided I was some kind of problem that needed to be solved. She never bothered to ask questions or try to understand the situation. She just assumed she had authority and started making demands. Her arrogance and need to control everything around her led to her being publicly humiliated and forced to spend significant money fixing a problem she'd created herself. Meanwhile, I got exactly what I wanted. Clearly marked property boundaries, an end to the trespassing, and peace and quiet to work on my projects. The survey stakes are still there, marking my land, and they've become a powerful reminder to anyone who might be thinking about ignoring property lines. My neighbor learned an expensive lesson about making assumptions, and I learned that sometimes the best response to entitled behavior is to let people hang themselves with their own rope. These days, I spend my mornings working on code, my afternoons working on cars, and my evenings enjoying the sunset over my private pond. Life is good when you don't have to deal with people who think they can boss you around on your own property. The irony isn't lost on me that my neighbor's attempt to force me off my land ended up giving me stronger legal documentation of my property rights than I'd ever had before. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where you don't have to be the bad guy. You just have to let entitled people show everyone exactly who they really are. I'm already planning my next restoration project. I'm thinking about a 1970 Chevelle this time. Something with a really loud engine that I can work on with the garage doors wide open on peaceful Saturday mornings. Update: 6 months later, the aftermath and sweet justice. I wasn't planning to write an update to this story, but so much has happened since my original post that I felt like people deserve to know how everything turned out. The short version is that my entitled neighbor's problems got much worse and my life got much better. Let me start with what happened immediately after the fence situation was resolved. For about 2 weeks, things were blissfully quiet. My neighbor and her husband kept to themselves, the trespassing stopped completely, and I was able to enjoy my property in peace. I thought that was the end of the story, but then my neighbor apparently decided she wasn't done fighting. About 3 weeks after the fence incident, I started getting visits from various county inspectors. First came someone from code enforcement claiming there had been complaints about unlicensed auto repair work being conducted on residential property. The inspector was actually pretty cool about it. I showed him my restoration project, explained it was a personal hobby, and he confirmed there were no violations. He even complimented the quality of my work on the Mustang. 2 days later, someone from Environmental Services showed up, claiming there had been reports of automotive fluids being improperly disposed of and potentially contaminating groundwater. Again, I showed the inspector around my workshop, demonstrated my proper waste disposal setup, and everything checked out fine. Then came animal control, responding to reports of aggressive dogs on the property. The inspector seemed confused since I don't own any dogs. When I explained the situation, he just shook his head and said he'd been getting a lot of nuisance calls from this address lately. It was pretty obvious what was happening. My neighbor was trying to use every government agency she could think of to cause me problems. Each inspector apologized for the inconvenience and mentioned they were required to respond to all complaints, even ones that seemed questionable. After the 4th or 5th bogus inspection in 2 weeks, I decided I'd had enough. I called the county commissioner's office and filed a formal complaint about harassment through false reporting. I provided documentation of all the inspections, copies of my neighbor's previous behavior, and the police report from the original incident. The county took it seriously. Apparently, making false reports to government agencies is a bigger deal than I realized, especially when there's a pattern of behavior. They launched an investigation and discovered my neighbor had been calling multiple departments with variations of the same complaints. That's when things got really interesting. During their investigation, the county discovered something I hadn't known about. My neighbor had been telling people in the development that she was president of their homeowners association. She'd been collecting dues from residents, issuing violations, and generally acting like she had official authority. The problem was that their development never actually established a legal HOA. The developer had mentioned the possibility in their marketing materials, but no formal organization was ever created. My neighbor had essentially been running a scam, collecting money and issuing fake violations with no legal standing whatsoever. When this came to light, several residents who had paid her money or received violations came forward. One family had paid her $800 in fake fines. Another had spent over $2,000 on landscaping changes she'd demanded. A retired couple had been bullied into repainting their house in colors she approved of. The county referred the matter to the district attorney's office for possible fraud charges. My neighbor suddenly found herself facing much bigger problems than a property line dispute. But wait, it gets better. During all this investigation, the surveyor I'd hired discovered something interesting about my neighbor's property. Remember how her fence was on my land? Well, it turns out her entire driveway was also partially on my property. Not just a few inches, but a good portion of it extending about 8 feet into my land. The surveyor explained that when the developer built the houses, they apparently made some errors with the property boundaries. My neighbor's house was built assuming they had more land than they actually purchased. Her driveway, her fancy stone walkway, part of her deck, and even a corner of her house were technically on my property. This put my neighbor in a very difficult position. She couldn't sell her house without clear title, and she couldn't get clear title with structures on someone else's land. She needed to either buy the land from me or move everything to her actual property lines. She tried to buy the strip of land, but I wasn't interested in selling. I'd bought 15 acres because I wanted 15 acres, and I wasn't about to give up part of my property to someone who'd been harassing me for months. Her only option was to move everything back to her actual property line. The cost estimate for moving the driveway, walkway, deck, and part of the house foundation was over $40,000. Her insurance wouldn't cover it since it wasn't damage from an accident or natural disaster, just poor initial construction. Meanwhile, the fraud investigation was moving forward. Several residents filed civil lawsuits against her for the money they'd lost to her fake HOA scheme. The criminal charges were still pending, but her lawyer was apparently working on some kind of plea deal. The stress of everything started taking its toll. Her husband filed for divorce about 4 months after the original incident. He told one of the other neighbors that he was tired of his wife's need to control everything and everyone around her, and that the legal problems were the final straw. My neighbor tried to represent herself in the civil lawsuits, claiming she'd been providing a legitimate service to the community. It didn't go well. She ended up having to pay restitution to all the residents she'd scammed, plus legal fees and court costs. The total was somewhere around $15,000. Unable to afford the property line corrections and facing mounting legal bills, she put her house up for sale. But potential buyers kept walking away once they discovered the property line issues and the need for expensive corrections. The house sat on the market for months. She finally found a buyer, but only after dropping the price by almost $60,000 to account for the property line problems. The new owners are planning to do the corrections as part of a major renovation project. My neighbor moved out last month. I watched from my deck as the moving truck loaded up her belongings. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 6 months since our first encounter. Her husband wasn't there to help. The new owners who bought her house stopped by to introduce themselves the day they moved in. They're a young couple with 2 small kids who seem genuinely nice. They apologized for any problems their predecessor had caused and asked if there was anything they should know about the property boundaries. I showed them the survey markers and explained the situation with the driveway and deck. They already knew about it from the inspection and were planning to fix everything as part of their renovation. They even asked if I'd be interested in selling them a small strip of land to make the corrections easier, offering a fair price for it. I agreed to sell them just enough land to square up their property lines properly. It solved their problem, gave me some extra cash, and maintained good neighbor relations. We closed on the land sale 2 weeks ago. The irony of the whole situation isn't lost on me. My original neighbor tried so hard to control me and my property that she ended up losing her house, her marriage, and facing criminal charges. Meanwhile, I got official surveys of my land, stronger legal documentation of my property rights, and ultimately even made some money from the land sale. The fake HOA scheme falling apart had consequences throughout the entire development. Residents realized they'd been living under made-up rules and paying unnecessary fees. Some of them organized to create a real HOA with proper legal structure and elected leadership, while others preferred to keep their properties independent. My Mustang restoration turned out beautifully, and I've been enjoying weekend drives through the countryside. I've started working on that 1970 Chevelle I mentioned, and the new neighbors don't seem to mind the occasional sound of classic engines being tuned. The trespassing issues never returned. Word had spread throughout the area about the property lines and the consequences of ignoring them. My private pond remains private, my woods stay peaceful, and my workshop continues to be my sanctuary. Looking back on everything, I'm amazed at how one person's entitlement and need for control led to such a spectacular downfall. My neighbor could have simply minded her own business and been a normal neighbor. Instead, her assumptions and aggressive behavior set off a chain of events that cost her everything. I learned a valuable lesson about documentation and standing up for your rights. Every photo I took, every inspection report I kept, and every interaction I documented ended up being useful when things escalated. It pays to be prepared when dealing with unreasonable people. The county commissioner's office sent me a letter thanking me for reporting the false complaints and helping them identify a pattern of abuse. Apparently, my case led to some policy changes about how they handle repeated nuisance reports from the same address. These days, my morning routine includes coffee on the deck while listening to birds around the pond. My afternoon routine includes working on classic cars with the garage doors open. My evening routine includes watching sunsets over my clearly marked, properly surveyed, completely private 15 acres. Sometimes I see my new neighbors working in their yard, and we wave to each other like normal people do. Their kids occasionally ask if they can see the old cars, and I'm happy to show them around the workshop. It's amazing how much better life is when everyone respects boundaries and treats each other with basic courtesy. The best part is knowing that my entitled former neighbor is somewhere else now, hopefully learning to mind her own business and leave other people alone. Though honestly, given her track record, she's probably already picking fights with her new neighbors about something. As for me, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do on my own property that nobody can question anymore. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it's incredibly satisfying to watch. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I was desperate to join a new job after my husband and I were both laid off last year. When I was offered a new role, I knew it would be a step down from what I was doing, but the manager and the team seemed great, and that part has not changed. However, since my manager Gary Asterisk was so busy, he basically offloaded me to another manager, Jane Asterisk. I was supposed to be the connection point between my team and Jane, but it quickly became Jane micromanaging me. She would ask me to work through lunch, move, cancel vacation days, call at 11 p.m. on weekends, and order me around on phone calls. She also made nasty comments about my weight and said I was big for my race. The list of personal slights so long that it filled 3 pages. I would talk back to her and she did not like that, and that provoked her more. I only stayed because we needed to pay the bills. Finally, I had a mental breakdown on a Friday afternoon, after she yelled at me for something trivial about scheduling a meeting without including someone from her team who I didn't know about. I was dealing with a family tragedy and couldn't take it anymore. I told Gary about the situation with Jane, and he was sympathetic and not at all surprised considering half her team quit. He immediately offered to move me to a different team under him. I was thrilled. Well, turns out going to the new team didn't help. Jane continued to order me around from afar. When I ignored her emails, she came to my desk one day and started loudly talking about how I am not qualified for this role. Gary overheard and finally told her off, but the verbal abuse did not stop. After 2 months there, I abruptly wrote my resignation letter and stapled the list of Jane's offensive comments and CC'd everyone. Gary offered a bunch of accommodations to try to keep me, but seeing how she was still provoking from afar, I said the only way for me to stay would be for her to go, and he did not have authority to let her go. Her manager was in a different country, and despite several HR complaints from at least 5 people, nothing was done. So I left, loudly and without shame, telling everyone exactly why I was leaving. Times were very bad for 3 months. There were nights we would eat slices of bread just so we could pay the mortgage and emergency expenses from a health crisis and a funeral. Even after he found a job, we were still catching up on bills and still are. I spent months applying to 5, 10 roles per day, sometimes over 20. Last month I saw a public memo about a big shot from a former company joining the company I just left. I used to work with this guy closely and texted him a "Congrats, let me know if you need any insights on the new place." We had a quick call where I told him some ins and outs where I thought they could innovate. After this call, he asked me to join the team as his chief of staff. I accepted. Imagine Jane's shock when we had our first all-hands call. All the VPs and above were asked to welcome the new Big Shot in a giant conference room. In Big Shot's speech, he breezed over that I'll be his chief of staff, along with a few key names. I now sat 2 levels above Jane, and apparently, within the 3 months I was not there, the other half of her team turned over. Every single person left. Gary was excited for me and said all nice things. However, Jane took the classless route and sent Big Shot an email about how I'm an unqualified idiot, that I used to work for her, how I tried to get her fired, and that she suspects I lied to get ahead. She didn't even try to be fake nice. Big Shot forwarded me her email and asked what this was about. I was so nervous and excited. Little did Jane know, I was a director at Big Shot's competitor company and was already a level above her, so 2 levels isn't a big leap, and I worked with him for 5 years. I had an hour call with Big Shot and told him she was bad for the company culture and was a nasty person in general, but the evidence he needed was Gary confirming that her whole team is turned over, my prior resignation letter, which was still sitting on my desktop when I logged in upon return, and a few other nasty emails she sent her recent staff, which they were happy to share with us. Big Shot fired Jane on Friday. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I had moved in the previous summer, late July, into a non-HOA community and didn't have any problems with any neighbors until the day after Halloween, when someone left a snarky note on my door about not having any holiday decorations up, and if I couldn't even afford a loused pumpkin on the porch, I probably was too poor to afford living there. Thanksgiving came and went, and I got another nasty little not saying I had better start showing some community spirit or else. Neither note was signed, and the cops just took my statement and said there was nothing they could do. That was my cue for enacting some malicious compliance. I went out and bought some lights and garlands and started putting them up when the neighbors started putting up theirs. Every couple days I'd add a few more until the front of the house was practically covered in glitz and glitter. On Christmas Eve I added one last piece, switched on all the lights and left them running until morning. Christmas morning found me waking to the sound of an angry voice and someone pounding on my door. I cracked open the inner door and left the security door locked. Dude objected to my Christmas star having 6 points instead of 5. He launched into a racist, hate-filled tirade against me and anyone displaying a 6-pointed star. Right about then, a cop car pulls up to the curb and 2 uniforms quietly walk up while the idiot continued to rant with many expletives, racist slurs, and some very violent threats. He must have seen I was smiling at something over his shoulder because he trooned around and stopped in mid-rant. There's gotta be fallout, of course. The neighbor was last seen sitting in the back of the patrol car as it pulled away. Yeah, I went downtown and signed the complaint. Later sat in on the hearing and had to admit under oath that a 6-pointed star is a legitimate symbol for the season. Dude got a fine and community service. I got to put up the same decorations without hassle for 2 more years before moving out of state. The next one is an entitled parent story. I'm a self-employed contractor. I go where I am needed for however many days I'm needed for. Sometimes it's a day or 2, sometimes it's a few hours. I park in customer or visitor parking or wherever else is open to any given person, unless the work order specifically says otherwise. I am also qualified for a disability parking pass due to issues I have with my knees and legs. I use it when I need it, and if I'm waffling, I'll take it only if there are others free. Better safe than sorry when it comes to my pain level intolerances. So, I'm on a multi-day, 1-day-a-week gig for a company downtown in my city where parking is problematic. Between the businesses and the apartment complex literally right next door, many have to walk for a chunk to get into the building or pay handsomely for parking. Thankfully, there's a disability parking space right out front that's typically free. Today, I'm hurting. It feels like crystals are growing in my joints and lifting my feet even curb height is basically my entire available energy stores. They had a ramp or else I would have left right then. No joke. I get out and there's someone in the smoking area right off my car. I don't like smelling like smoke at the end of my day, but it is what it is. This is also where we meet the star of our story, Karen. Yes, I use that name, but it's well deserved. Trust me. She says something to me right as I exit my car, but I can't hear her cause of road traffic, so I walk around the side so we can talk more clearly. If you're not paying attention, it may have looked like I walked around the side like a typical person would. In reality, I'm leaning hard on my car because I'm hurting, and meds haven't kicked in yet. Cue this lovely interaction. Karen, you can't park there. There are people in wheelchairs that need it more. No one was around, so she was obviously meaning some mystery person in the future would need it. Quick side note. Why is it that when an ableist person wants to be entitled, it's always a wheelchair user, not walker, cane, or arm crutches? It's beginning to be a sign of what's about to come, TBH. I was, however, finally able to use a line I'd had loaded for way too long. This is give or take, but you'll get the idea. Me. Since when did you become my doctor and determine I don't need accessible parking anymore? Karen. You park here all day long and other people need to get into the bank. Additional disability parking is available directly around the corner and on the main entrance to the bank, so... Me. Ma'am, why do you care? I'm allowed to park here. Karen. No, you're not. Other people need it more than you do, and they can't park here if you are. Again, no one was around, and the bank was even closed. Me. Ma'am, I'm allowed to park here. I'm not here all day, and even if I was, there's no time limit on this spot. Lots of 2-hour less parking spaces nearby. Karen isn't letting this go, so I pull out my phone to record for my own safety. She stops talking, long enough for the security guard parked literally next to me to say, "She's allowed to park here." I didn't hear it, but I would confirm it later. But despite the camera still rolling, Karen can't help herself. Karen, you can't park here. You've been here every day for the last 2 weeks, and other people need it more than you. Me, despite the fact that I look normal, I need this space. You are not my doctor, and he would not risk his license lying on an official form just so I can have more convenient parking. Karen, you have been here all day, every day for 2 weeks. You shouldn't be parking here. Me. I wasn't even here yesterday, nor the day before, nor the day before, nor the day before that. Karen. Yes, you were. Me. No, I wasn't. I was at address. Would you like to see my GPS logs? I keep them for tax reasons. Karen. Glossing over that, I can prove her wrong. You work in that building. You can't park here if you work in that building. You'll be here all day and other people need it more. Me. There is no time limit on this space. Moving my camera to the parking sign and I have a permit. I'm allowed to park here. And I don't work in that building. I work here tapping my magnetic business logo attached to my open car door and right in front of Karen. Repeat that interaction 3 more times. Karen, well, we'll just see when your car gets towed. If you want to risk it, that's up to you. I zoom in on her face on my phone, not knowing if I'm capturing anything cause the early morning sun with its famous glare is everywhere. I figure just in case she slashes my tires or something, I have her face on my phone. That shut her up enough to get my stuff and walk to the front door, with obvious limp and limb-lifting restrictions. Karen tries to say something right when I get to the door, the last desperate move of the istists and those who, despite being proven wrong, still can't let it go, but instead of listening to her, me. Ma'am, I'm done talking to you about this. You're not my doctor, you're not my family, nor anyone I care about. I'm not proving myself to a stranger, proving myself disabled enough for your liking. Then I all but literally dropped the mic and walked away. Not too long later, I go down under the guise of forgetting something from my care. Turns out I really did forget something, so it was all good. 'Cause I felt like Karen was gonna pull something, and I just got a bad vibe. The security guard and his partner were still out front, and Karen was thankfully gone. I asked him if anyone had an issue with me parking there, making sure I wasn't in the apartment complex's assigned spaces or something just to be safe. He said he told Karen I was allowed to park there, and she threatened to have me towed. He said he told her to call the cops, but that I was legally allowed there, and they wouldn't do squat. The guard's partner totally has similar issues with her joints, and she 100% emphasized with me about the feeling of crunchy crystals growing in your extremities. She told her partner that they should keep an eye on my car to be safe and not to worry about Karen. Karen was the neighborhood gossip and was always telling or up in everyone else's business. She didn't even own a car. A while later, I go back to my car for parts, and I see her talking to people by the bank in loading zones with blue curbs, aka disability parking. She's telling them that I won't move, so they have to stay back here. Everyone she talked to literally said, "It's okay, I don't mind, I'm good here," or some version of that. Right before I packed up for the day, I went to the window and saw Karen back in the smoking area. Of course, she was eyeballing my car, glaring at it, really, so I grabbed my keys and honked them to make sure she couldn't screw with me just in case I'd forgotten or it was unlocked somehow. She jumps slightly, looking around as if trying to find me, but doesn't see me. The windows are reflective from the outside, so she can't find me even if she'd thought to look up to my story. I honked it again for good measure, laughing all the way back to my tools and finished packing up. I think the part that stands out the most is the fact that she didn't ask me to move. She just told me I couldn't park there, so some mystery person that may or may not want to at some future point could over me. Ableist are some of the most entitled people I have ever dealt with. Anyway, thank you for watching.